I was 36 years old when it happened, and I thought by then I had seen everything an emergency physician could see. My name is Dr. Jonathan Hale. I trained in Baltimore, cut my teeth in some of the busiest trauma centers on the East Coast, and eventually took a staff position at St. Catherine's Medical Center, a regional hospital tucked between the harbor and the old city blocks where crime and poverty coexist with generational pride. By then, I had been 10 years in practice, 5 years board certified, and had handled everything from mangled bodies pulled out of highway wrecks to delicate pediatric codes where the silence of a child's heart stops an entire department cold. I told myself nothing could surprise me, but there is one case, one patient, whose memory I cannot bury no matter how many nights I walk these halls. The ER at St. Catherine's never sleeps. Even at 3 a.m, the hum of fluorescent lights paints the walls in that cold, green-white glow, and the rhythmic hiss of the pneumatic doors reminds us that the world outside never stops feeding us the broken, the bleeding, the desperate. You learn to notice the soundtrack of suffering, ambulance sirens bending in the distance, the monotone call of overhead pages, the sterile smell of chlorhexidine layered over sweat, fear, and sometimes blood that dries in the corners of stretchers, no matter how hard housekeeping scrubs. This place is a crucible. It burns away hesitation and leaves only reflex and endurance. That night began, as so many others had, with a stack of charts already waiting, and nurses weaving between rooms with the efficiency of dancers who know every step. I was sipping black coffee, lukewarm and bitter, when triage called out that a young man had just walked in, complaining of swelling behind his ear. Ordinarily, a lump or infection is low priority compared to chest pain or gunshot wounds. But the triage nurse sounded unsettled. She used a tone I'd come to recognize, the tone of someone who had seen something they couldn't quite place. The patient was 24, name entered as Daniel Mercer, and he came in alone. He was pale but not sickly, tall and lean with an anxious energy that made him scan every corner of the waiting room as if he were being followed. When I first laid eyes on him in exam room 3, I noticed the way he held his head slightly tilted, like the weight of something behind his right ear pulled at him. His eyes met mine, and for a brief second I felt something I couldn't explain, an intensity, a gravity, as though his gaze carried an entire story I wasn't yet meant to hear. "Doc," he said quietly, voice trembling. "It started as nothing, just a little bump. But it keeps growing. And sometimes I hear things." Now, a lot of patients in the ER mention hearing things. We see schizophrenia, meth-induced psychosis, trauma-induced hallucinations. My training made me catalog those possibilities immediately. But as he angled his head and parted the hair, I saw the swelling. A firm, smooth mound, rising just behind the mastoid bone. Not angry red like an abscess. Not soft like a cyst. It looked almost symmetrical, like something sculpted rather than grown. I gloved up, palpated gently, and felt a chill. The surface was warm but not fevered. The edges were defined, unnervingly perfect, as though the mass had been placed there by design. Daniel flinched when I pressed deeper, but not from pain, more like a recoil from something intimate, invasive. We ordered the standard labs, CBC and metabolic panel, to rule out infection or systemic illness. I called for a CT scan of the head and neck, because any unexplained growth near the skull base can mean serious things. Tumors, mastoiditis, lymphoma. I explained this to him, keeping my voice calm, the way we're trained to do, but I could see his breathing quicken. His pupils dilated. He whispered, "You don't understand. It talks to me when I'm alone." I paused, pen hovering over the chart. "What talks to you, Daniel?" "The thing inside," he said, staring straight at me. I've heard delusions voiced with conviction before, but this wasn't the fragmented ramble of psychosis. His words carried a strange composure, as though he was describing a fact of his life, something undeniable. I made a note, though my hand trembled slightly. Nurses later told me they felt it too, that eerie sense that the room grew colder when he spoke. The CT was scheduled, but transport was delayed because of a trauma alert. 2 victims of a bar stabbing rolled in, priorities shifted, and Daniel was left waiting in his room. I went in periodically to check on him. Each time, he seemed more agitated, pressing his palm to the swelling as if trying to keep something contained. At one point he whispered, "If it comes out, none of us will be safe." By then, the rational part of me was cataloging everything. Possible temporal lobe involvement, auditory hallucinations secondary to Mass Effect, or maybe he had been reading too much online and convinced himself of something sinister. But there was another part of me, the part that lives in shadows despite the years of science, that wondered if I was looking at something beyond anatomy. As the night stretched on, the ER thinned out. The stabbing victims stabilized and were sent to surgery. The waiting room emptied except for a homeless man dozing under a blanket and a mother with a feverish child. Around 2:30 a.m., the transport tech finally arrived for Daniel's scan. As they wheeled him past me, he caught my sleeve with surprising strength and whispered in my ear. His breath was hot, his words low enough that only I heard. "If they find nothing, don't be relieved. It only means it's not of this world." They wheeled Daniel down the hall, and I followed a few steps behind. Sometimes doctors do that, shadow a patient without announcing it, because a part of us knows the case is about to turn into something we'll need to witness firsthand. The radiology suite was quiet, the kind of quiet that lives inside machines. The CT scanner waited, that open white ring humming faintly, like a gate to some other dimension. The tech, Marianne, had been with us for years, calm, professional, good at putting patients at ease. She spoke softly to Daniel as she guided him onto the table, explaining the procedure, the contrast dye, the importance of staying still. He nodded, though his eyes darted to the ceiling corners, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. As the scan began, I watched from the control room, the glow of the monitor painting shadows across Marianne's face. Slices of Daniel's head and neck appeared on the screen, each one stacking like pages of a story. At first, it seemed routine, normal bony landmarks, soft tissues well defined. But then the images reached the region behind his right ear. The mass came into view, and the room fell into a silence heavier than lead. It was there, but it wasn't. No clear margins, no density consistent with infection or tumor. Instead, a distortion, as though the image itself recoiled from showing us the truth. The pixels blurred at the edges, a hazy halo where there should have been clarity. Marianne frowned, adjusted the settings, rescanned. The result was the same. The anomaly looked less like tissue and more like absence, a void pressed against bone. I leaned closer, heart knocking in my chest. "Is this an artifact?" I asked. Marianne shook her head, lips pressed tight. "I've never seen one behave like that." Daniel's voice crackled through the intercom. "It doesn't like being seen." For a moment, none of us moved. Then Marianne finished the scan, though her hands trembled slightly as she released the table. When she opened the door, Daniel sat up slowly, his face pale but composed. He looked directly at me. "Did it show you?" he asked. Back in the ER, I pulled the images up with radiology. The attending on call, Dr. Patel, was meticulous, a man who prided himself on clarity. He scrolled through the slices again and again, muttering under his breath. "This doesn't conform to anatomy. It's not pathological. It's not structural. It's—" He trailed off, eyes narrowing. Finally, he looked at me and said, "I can't explain this, John. You'll need neurosurgery to weigh in, but they'll laugh us out of the room." Daniel sat quietly in his bay, hands folded, as though he already knew. I pulled the curtain and sat across from him, breaking the usual distance between doctor and patient. "Daniel," I began carefully, "what do you think is happening to you?" He looked at me with a calmness that unsettled me more than fear would have. "It's not mine," he said. "It's waiting." Waiting for what? He tilted his head slightly, the way he had when he walked in, for the door to open. We admitted him for observation. His vitals remained stable. Those heart rates spiked unpredictably, sudden bursts of tachycardia that would resolve on their own. Nurses reported odd behavior. One said she heard him speaking in a low voice when no one else was in the room. Another swore she saw his monitor flicker even when the leads were secure. I chalked it up to fatigue, to the way night shifts warp perception, but the whispers kept coming. Around 4 a.m. I went back to check on him. The ward was hushed, most patients asleep, the fluorescent lights dimmed. His curtain was drawn, but I could see his silhouette seated upright on the bed. When I stepped inside, he was staring at the window though the blinds were closed. "It's closer," he said softly. "What is?" "The thing behind the door." I felt a prickle crawl up my spine. "Daniel, I need you to tell me if you're having thoughts of hurting yourself, or if you're afraid of hurting others." He shook his head slowly, never looking at me. "It's not me you should fear." By dawn, I had more questions than answers. Neurosurgery reviewed the scans and dismissed them as artifact. Psychiatry evaluated him, found no overt psychosis, though they noted his affect was unsettlingly congruent with bizarre beliefs. We were left with nothing concrete. And yet, I could not forget the words he whispered into my sleeve. "If they find nothing, don't be relieved." Because that's exactly what they found. And that absence terrified me more than any tumor ever could. By mid-morning, the ER was alive again, with the daytime chaos. Paramedics wheeling in chest pain patients, the waiting room brimming with coughs and twisted ankles, the phones ringing in relentless cadence. Yet even in the noise, my mind stayed tethered to Daniel. He was up in observation, monitored, but otherwise unchanged. The lump behind his ear still pressed outward, still symmetrical and foreign, still beyond classification. I made rounds, wrote notes, answered consults, but each step felt like I was moving on autopilot. My thoughts dragged back to room 412 where he waited. A kind of pressure followed me, as if a thread tied me to him. By noon I gave in and climbed the stairs to check again. The room was dim. He had pulled the curtains, leaving only a thin shaft of daylight cutting across his bed. Daniel sat upright, hands folded in his lap. His gaze fixed, not on the wall, not on the window, but on the empty air before him. "They still don't see it, do they?" he said before I even opened my mouth. I paused. The scans were inconclusive, I admitted. "Inconclusive," he echoed softly, almost with pity. "That's what they call it when they don't want to admit it's beyond them." I sat down across from him, resisting the urge to shift in my chair. "Daniel, tell me exactly what you experience." He turned, finally meeting my eyes. And in that moment, I felt as if I were staring into something older than him, older than me, older than the hospital walls themselves. It whispers when I try to sleep. Sometimes it tells me to open myself, to let it through. Other times it screams, not with words, but with hunger. "You don't understand, doctor. It's not inside my body. My body is only the hinge." I ordered an MRI, hoping for clarity, more precise imaging, higher resolution. Maybe the void would take shape? The scan was scheduled for later that afternoon. In the meantime, I checked his labs again. White count normal. No metabolic derangements. Thyroid function fine. Everything clinical told me he was healthy. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was feeding, not on his blood or organs, but on his very presence. At 3 p.m., transport wheeled him to MRI. I walked with them again, uneasy. The magnet roared to life, its rhythmic thumping filling the suite. I watched from behind the glass as sequences appeared. This time, the void sharpened, not into tissue, not into pathology, but into pattern. A geometry that didn't belong. Shapes that bent into each other like overlapping circles, fractals of darkness that seemed to pulse with the machine's rhythm. The radiologist muttered, "What the hell is this?" He tapped the monitor, adjusted sequences, tried different weights. The image persisted, almost defiant. Halfway through, Daniel cried out, not in pain, but in ecstasy or terror. I couldn't tell. His body arched, eyes squeezed shut, the mass behind his ear pulsing visibly under the skin. Alarms blared. Nurses rushed in, the scan aborted. When we reached him, he was conscious, breathing fast, sweat beading his forehead. He grabbed my wrist and whispered with startling force, "It saw you too." I froze, his fingers like iron on my skin. His pupils were blown wide, his lips cracked. He released me only when sedation was administered, his body slackening under the medication. Later, in the radiology review room, the images looped on the screen. Dr. Patel shook his head, muttering something about magnetic artifact, about interference. But when he left, I lingered. Alone in that cold room, I stared at the shapes. And I could swear they shifted subtly, not with the machine, but with my gaze, as if they were aware of being watched. By the fourth night, exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. I had worked 48 hours out of the past 72, but it wasn't the shifts that wore me down. It was the weight of Daniel's case pressing on every waking thought. The ER had returned to its usual rhythm of broken bones, chest pains, and the occasional overdose, but each time I crossed the observation unit, the air seemed heavier, as if something in that one room was altering the atmosphere for everyone else. Daniel hadn't worsened, but he hadn't improved either. The swelling behind his ear remained, steady and unnatural, no fluctuation, no change with time. What did change was him. He grew quieter, his words sharper, almost prophetic. Nurses reported he could predict their steps before they entered. One swore he whispered, "Don't drop the tray," seconds before she stumbled, nearly spilling medications. Another said he called out the name of her dead brother as she adjusted his IV. I wanted to dismiss it all as suggestion, the mind playing tricks when primed by fear. But even I felt it, the peculiar sensation that his room listened, that the shadows stretched differently when the curtain opened. That night, I stood at the nurses' station reviewing labs when alarms blared from his monitor. Heart rate spiking, 120, 140, 160. I rushed in with the team. Daniel lay back on the bed, eyes wide, body rigid, pulse hammering. The swelling behind his ear pulsed visibly, a rhythmic rise and fall, like something alive beneath the skin. "Seizure?" a nurse asked. "No," I said, though I wished it were that simple. His body wasn't convulsing. He was perfectly still, except for the racing of his heart and the unnatural throb behind his ear. Then he spoke, clear, calm, every word cutting the air. "It's almost through." The monitor spiked again, heart rate 190, oxygen saturation dropping. We prepared for code. Crash cart wheeled in, IV wide open, pads ready. But before I could order anything, he grabbed my wrist with sudden, impossible strength. His touch burned, hot like fever, though his skin was cool. "Don't close it," he whispered. Later, when the room was quiet, I sat by his bedside. His eyes fluttered open, focused on me with unnerving clarity. "Do you believe me now?" he asked. I swallowed, searching for ground to stand on. "I believe something is happening," I admitted. He nodded slowly, as though that was enough. Then he said, "When I was a child, I dreamed of a door, always the same one, behind me in the dark. I thought it was just fear, but now I know, it's here. And it wants to be opened." His words hung in the sterile air, heavier than the hiss of oxygen, heavier than the hum of machines. I thought about every textbook, every lecture, every years-long training drilled into me, all designed to anchor me in the tangible. Yet here I was, listening to a patient describe the architecture of something beyond medicine, and a part of me, the part one had kept hidden since childhood, recognized it. At 3 a.m., his vitals surged again. This time, lights in the ward flickered. Monitors in nearby rooms glitched. Nurses whispered prayers under their breath. When I entered, the swelling behind his ear had changed. It wasn't larger, but the skin seemed thinner, stretched, as if something pressed outward, eager to escape. I reached for gloves, intending to palpate, but stopped. The sight paralyzed me. For a fleeting second, I saw, not with my eyes, but somewhere deeper, a shape pushing beneath that skin, not human, not describable. A suggestion of geometry, a twisting of light and shadow, something that didn't belong in flesh. Daniel's voice cut through my paralysis. "If it comes through, doctor, it won't go back." The monitor screamed again. His heart raced, his breathing ragged. We fought to stabilize him, pushing meds, adjusting oxygen, calling rapid response. But through it all, his eyes never left mine. And in them, I saw not fear, but a strange resignation. The final night began like so many others, but something in the air told me we were reaching the end. The ER hummed with its usual chorus, ventilators sighing, monitors chirping, overhead calls echoing through the halls. But beneath it all was a tension I couldn't shake, as though the hospital itself was bracing for something. Daniel had grown weaker, though not in the way illness weakens a patient. His vitals dipped only sporadically. His blood work remained pristine. His neurological exams were mostly intact. Yet his presence diminished, as if he were receding from us, stepping back from the light of this world. The swelling behind his ear had not grown, but it seemed sharper now, the skin pulled taut, the outline more defined. Nurses avoided looking at it directly. Some crossed themselves when they left his room. I spent much of the evening at his bedside, charting under the dim light, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. When he stirred, he spoke softly, not to me, but to something unseen. His words were in fragments, pleas, refusals, bargains. At times he would pause mid-sentence, as though listening to a reply. Once, his eyes filled with tears, and he whispered, "Not him. Not the doctor. Take me instead." My chest tightened at those words, though I did not ask him to explain. Near midnight, alarms shrieked again. His heart rate spiked. Monitors flickered. Lights in the corridor dimmed. I rushed in with the team. His body arched, sweat streaming down his face, veins standing out along his neck. The mass behind his ear pulsed violently, as though something struck against it from within. We prepared for code once more. IV fluids wide open, crash cart at the ready, my voice steady though my hands trembled. "Daniel, stay with us," I said. His eyes snapped open, impossibly wide, and what I saw in them chilled me to the marrow. Not fear, not pain, but recognition, like someone opening a door for a long-expected guest. "It's here," he whispered. At that moment, every monitor in the ward flatlined. Not just his. All of them. A chorus of alarms, screamed, then silenced. For 10 long seconds, the ward plunged into a darkness more complete than any power outage. Even emergency backup lights failed. We were left standing in absolute void. I swear, in that silence, I heard it too. Not words, not sound exactly, but a presence pressing in on me. Cold, vast, endless. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in pitch black, knowing something immense was waiting below. Then, just as suddenly, the lights returned. The monitors rebooted. The ward hummed again with the mechanical chatter of life. Daniel lay still on the bed. His vitals returned to baseline, stable, almost serene. The swelling behind his ear had receded. Not gone, but smaller, softer, less defined. He looked at me, a faint smile on his lips. "It chose not to come through," he said. "Not tonight." And then he closed his eyes and slept. By morning he was gone. Not dead, gone. His bed empty, sheets undisturbed, no sign of discharge paperwork or transport. Security swore no one saw him leave. His chart disappeared from the system, as though erased. Staff who had cared for him argued about whether he had ever truly been admitted. Some claimed to remember him, others shrugged blankly, insisting I must be mistaken. But I remember. I remember his eyes, his voice, the way the machines died, and the air itself grew heavy. I remember the shapes in the MRI, the whispers in the dark. I remember the mass that throbbed like a second heart behind his ear. I returned to that room the next night, standing in the doorway long after my shift had ended. The air was normal, the bed occupied by another patient, the monitors steady. Yet I felt it still, the echo of something waiting, just out of sight, pressed against the thin walls of our world. In the years since, I have tried to reason it away. Perhaps he was delusional. Perhaps the scans were corrupted. Perhaps my exhaustion distorted reality. But late at night, when the ER quiets and shadows grow long, I hear his whisper in my memory. Don't be relieved if they find nothing. And I wonder if someday, in another patient in another room, the door will finally open. The case will always haunt me because it taught me the most terrifying truth a doctor can face. Not every mystery is ours to solve, and not every door should be opened.